I sat at my desk in the cabin, Dave Wilson's letter spread open before me. The paper had creased along the fold lines after months of opening and closing it, as if reading it one more time might change what was written there. Outside, snow blanketed the pines. Winter had come early to the foothills outside Calgary, but inside, the wood stove kept things warm enough. 3 months since the letter arrived, and I still didn't know what to do with it, or about it. 22 years guiding trips through the Canadian wilderness, and nothing had prepared me for what happened in Banff. I'd seen bears charge clients, helped evacuate people with broken legs, even talked down a guy having a full psychotic break after eating mushrooms he found beside the trail. But what happened with Vanessa Thompson and those college kids from Charleston University, that was something else entirely. I got up and made coffee. The ritual helped settle my thoughts. My little cabin wasn't much, but it gave me space to think between guiding seasons. A one-room affair with a loft bedroom, wood stove, and a view of the mountains that made up for the lack of amenities. Back at the desk, I pulled out the folder labeled Charleston University 2018 from my filing cabinet. Inside were all the documents from that trip: contracts, medical forms, emergency contacts, route plans. Might as well start at the beginning, I muttered to myself. It had seemed like any other university booking at first. Charleston needed a guide for 12 students and 1 chaperone. They wanted a week-long trek through the Canadian Rockies, something challenging enough to give students their outdoor education credits, but not so difficult that it required technical climbing skills. Standard stuff. I'd done dozens of these university trips. They paid well and helped fill the gap between tourist seasons. When the initial email came through, I checked my calendar and saw I was free. The timing worked out perfectly. Early September, after the summer rush, but before winter set in. Weather would be cool, but manageable. Crowds would be thinning out. Perfect conditions. I remember reviewing the medical forms with a certain professional detachment. No severe allergies. No one with asthma bad enough to worry about at altitude. A couple of kids with mild food restrictions, but nothing that would complicate meal planning. Most seemed reasonably fit, with histories of hiking, camping, or sports. The university liaison, a professor named Geller, emphasized during our phone call that these weren't party kids. They're serious biology students, he told me. This is part of their environmental science program. They're there to learn, not to get drunk in the woods. That was always good news. Nothing worse than babysitting college kids who saw the wilderness as an excuse to get wasted away from campus security. I took another sip of coffee and flipped through the documents, finding the list of students. 12 names. I tried to match them with faces in my memory. Some came back easily. Dave Wilson, tall kid with sandy hair. John Parker, athletic build, seemed confident. Others were hazier, blending together in that way faces do when you've guided hundreds of groups over the years. And then there was Vanessa Thompson. Her name wasn't on the original paperwork. When Professor Geller first contacted me, he was supposed to be the chaperone. 2 weeks before the trip, I got an email saying he'd come down with pneumonia and a graduate teaching assistant would take his place, Vanessa Thompson. I had no reason to question the switch. Universities did this all the time. Professors backed out, got sick, had family emergencies. Having a younger chaperone sometimes worked better anyway. They usually connected with the students more easily, had more energy for the physical demands of the trail. I pulled out my map of Banff National Park, tracing the route we'd taken with my finger, Lake Minnewanka. We'd planned to set up base camp there and spend 3 days exploring the surrounding areas. The lake was beautiful, surrounded by mountains, with clear, cold water and good camping spots. I'd guided dozens of groups there without incident. The letter from Dave sat beside the map, its message burning in my brain even when I wasn't looking at it. I don't know what's happening to me, he'd written. I get these hungers. Regular food doesn't help. Last night I attacked Sarah. I don't remember much, just this overwhelming need. I woke up covered in blood. She's in the hospital now. I told everyone it was an animal attack. They believe me, but I know what I did. I closed the folder. Sometimes I wished I could just burn it all, the letter, the documents, the memories, but destroying evidence seemed like crossing a line I wasn't ready to cross. After the Banff incident, I'd been careful with what I told the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, not because I wanted to hide anything, but because I knew how it would sound. The chaperone turned into some kind of monster and attacked the students. Yeah, that would go over well. They'd have me in for a psychiatric evaluation faster than I could blink, so I'd edited the truth, told them Vanessa had some kind of breakdown, attacked some students, ran off into the woods. It was close enough to what happened that I could tell it convincingly, leaving out only the parts that would make me sound crazy. I got up and walked to the window. The snow was falling harder now, big flakes drifting down through the pines. In a few weeks, I'd close up the cabin and head south for winter guiding work. Usually, the change of scenery helped clear my head, but I wasn't sure anything would help with this. The folder sat on my desk, a physical reminder of something I couldn't explain, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the natural world and what lived in it. I should start from the beginning, I thought. Try to make sense of it all. It had been a normal booking. That's what I kept coming back to. Nothing about it seemed unusual. The university had good references, the students had decent outdoor experience, everything on paper looked perfect. Looking at their group photo now, a printout the university had sent with their initial paperwork, they looked like typical college kids, clean-cut, eager, smiling at the camera in front of their science building back in Charleston. Bright futures ahead of them. They had no idea what was waiting in those mountains. Neither did I. Before that trip, I would have said I knew the wilderness. 22 years guiding people through the most remote parts of Canada had given me confidence bordering on complacency. I knew the trails, the weather patterns, the wildlife behaviors. I knew how to keep people safe. But nothing in my experience had prepared me for what happened at Lake Minnewanka. I sat back down at my desk and opened the folder again, forcing myself to confront the memories. If I was going to understand Dave's letter, if I was going to help him, I needed to remember everything exactly as it happened, not the sanitized version I gave the RCMP, not the nightmares that still woke me up sweating. The truth, as best as I could recall it. It started with a routine airport pickup. That much I was sure of. I drove to Calgary International to meet the Charleston University group, not knowing that everything I understood about the natural world was about to change. I put away the folder containing Dave's letter and checked my watch. The memories would have to wait. It was time to begin the trip that would change everything. The drive to Calgary International took about an hour from my cabin. I arrived early, as was my habit for client pickups. Professional punctuality had served me well over 22 years in the wilderness guide business. I parked the charter van in the short-term lot and made my way to the arrivals area, holding a sign with Charleston University written in neat block letters. Their flight from Chicago landed on time. I watched the passengers stream through the security doors, studying faces and matching them to the group profile I'd reviewed. College students were usually easy to spot, traveling in clusters, laughing too loudly, wearing university-branded clothing. This group was no exception. They appeared in a tight bunch, 12 students looking exactly as I expected, tired from travel but buzzing with the particular excitement that comes from being young and suddenly in a foreign country. Some wore hiking boots already broken in. Others had brand new outdoor gear still showing price tag creases. Standard university field trip mix, some experienced, some novices. The woman leading them caught my attention immediately. Vanessa Thompson was younger than the usual faculty chaperones for these trips, probably in her late 20s. Where Professor Geller had described himself as an old biology professor with bad knees, Vanessa moved with an athletic bounce in her step. She spotted my sign and made a beeline toward me. "James Miller?" she asked, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, confident. "I'm Vanessa Thompson. the TA filling in for Professor Geller. Up close, I noticed her eyes were alert and searching, taking in everything around her with keen interest. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, but a few strands had escaped to frame her face. She wore hiking pants and a lightweight technical jacket, clearly someone who knew appropriate outdoor gear. "Nice to meet you," I said. "Hope your flight was smooth." "As smooth as flying gets these days," she laughed. "Everyone's excited to finally be here. Let me introduce you to the group." She turned and waved the students closer. They gathered around as she pointed to each one, rattling off names faster than I could possibly remember. I nodded politely, knowing it would take me at least a day or two to match all the names to faces reliably. Dave Wilson stood out immediately, tall with sandy hair just as his photo had shown. He had an easy smile and seemed at home in the outdoors gear he wore, not awkward like some of the others who were clearly wearing new boots and jackets. "Dave's our resident nature photographer," Vanessa said, putting her hand on his shoulder briefly. "He's promised to document everything." Dave nodded. "Been looking forward to shooting the Rockies for years." After introductions, we headed to baggage claim. The students bunched together around the carousel, pointing out each other's bags. Vanessa moved among them with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd spent plenty of time with the group. She laughed easily at their jokes, helped spot luggage, and generally kept them organized without seeming to try. I noticed how the students responded to her, particularly the male students. They stood a little straighter when she approached, laughed a little louder at her comments. Not unusual behavior around an attractive young teacher, but I filed it away as part of my automatic assessment of group dynamics. When all the bags were collected, I led them to the parking area where our charter van waited. The students piled their gear into the back, and I supervised the loading to make sure everything was secure. "Everyone find a seat," I called out. "It's about 3 hours to Jasper, depending on traffic." The students sorted themselves into the back seats, plugging in headphones and settling in for the drive. Vanessa took the front passenger seat beside me. "Mind if I ride shotgun?" she asked. "I want to pick your brain about the area." "Not at all," I said, starting the engine. "That's what I'm here for." As we pulled away from the airport and headed toward the Trans-Canada Highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Most of the students were already dozing or staring at their phones. Dave sat near the back, camera already out, taking photos through the window as Calgary's outskirts slipped past. "So, how long have you been guiding in the Canadian Rockies?" Vanessa asked as we merged onto the highway. 22 years now," I replied. "Started right after college and never found a reason to stop." "That's amazing. What's the most dangerous situation you've ever faced out there?" The question was one I got often, but her tone held genuine curiosity rather than just making conversation. I told her about a sudden blizzard that had trapped a group on an exposed ridge for 2 days, how we dug snow caves and rationed supplies until the weather cleared. "How did you keep everyone calm?" she asked, leaning slightly closer. "People take their cues from the guide," I explained. "If I panic, they panic. If I stay steady, they usually do too." "Good leadership principle," she nodded. "I'll remember that with these guys." For the next hour, Vanessa kept the questions coming. She wanted to know about wildlife patterns, weather systems, geological formations, everything that would make her a better chaperone for the trip. I appreciated her engagement. Too many faculty escorts viewed these trips as a chance to zone out while the guide did all the work. When we stopped at a rest area halfway to Jasper, I watched how she interacted with the students. She moved from group to group, checking in with each of them, making sure they were drinking water and had what they needed. I noticed she spent extra time with Dave, and another athletic-looking student I remembered was named John Parker. Nothing inappropriate, just friendly conversation, but there was an energy to her interactions with the male students that differed slightly from how she spoke with the women. Back on the road, the landscape gradually transformed as we approached the mountains. The prairies gave way to foothills, and eventually the towering peaks of the Rockies appeared on the horizon. Some of the students woke up to take photos or point out particularly dramatic views. "I've always wanted to see the Canadian Rockies," Vanessa said, gazing out the window. "They're even more beautiful than I imagined." "Wait until you see them up close on the trail," I told her. "Photos don't do them justice." "What can we expect in Jasper tonight?" she asked, pulling a notebook from her bag. "I want to make sure everyone's prepared for tomorrow." I outlined the plan, checking into the hostel, a quick orientation meeting, dinner in town, and an early night to prepare for our first day of training and acclimation. "Perfect," she said, jotting notes. "The students need some real food and proper sleep after travel day." As we neared Jasper, the mountains grew closer, massive and imposing against the late afternoon sky. The students became more animated, taking photos and pointing out features to each other. I heard Dave explaining something about different types of mountain formations to a group of students clustered around him. We pulled into Jasper just before dinner time. The small mountain town was busy with tourists, even though peak season was winding down. I navigated the van through narrow streets to the hostel where I'd booked the group. "Everyone grab your own bags," Vanessa called out as I parked. "We need to make a good impression on our first day." The students piled out, retrieving their gear with minimal confusion. They followed me inside where I handled check-in with the hostel manager. Vanessa organized the room assignments with a clipboard and marker, efficiently sorting everyone by gender into the appropriate dorm-style rooms. "Orientation meeting in the common room in 30 minutes, she announced after everyone had their bed assignments. "Shower if you need to, but don't be late." I watched her take charge with practiced ease and felt a sense of relief. Sometimes university groups came with chaperones who were disengaged or overwhelmed, making my job twice as difficult. Vanessa seemed like the opposite. Competent, prepared, and genuinely invested in the students' experience. As the students dispersed to find their rooms, Dave approached Vanessa with a question about camera equipment. I was too far away to hear the specifics, but I noticed how he seemed comfortable talking with her, less awkward than some of the other male students who became tongue-tied in her presence. While they spoke, I unloaded the last of my personal gear and checked the van to make sure nothing was left behind. By the time I finished, most of the students had found their rooms and were getting settled. Vanessa joined me near the front desk, her clipboard tucked under her arm. "What do you think of the group so far?" she asked. "They seem solid," I replied. "Good mix of experience levels, but nobody who looks like they'll struggle too much with the terrain we have planned." "They're good kids," she nodded. "Serious about their studies. This isn't just a fun trip for them. They're getting major credit for the environmental science components." "That's what Professor Geller mentioned," I said. "Always easier when they have academic motivation beyond just hiking in pretty places." "Exactly," she smiled, "though the pretty places don't hurt." By the time we gathered for the orientation meeting, I felt good about how things were shaping up. The students appeared rested enough after their travel day. Vanessa was proving to be a capable and engaged chaperone, and the weather forecast for our trek into Banff National Park looked nearly perfect. I had no way of knowing then that in less than a week, I'd be fighting to get those same students out of the wilderness alive, or that the enthusiastic young teaching assistant sitting across from me would become something I still couldn't fully explain. The orientation meeting wrapped up as the last light faded from the sky outside the hostel windows. I handed out maps to each student, giving them a chance to study our planned route, while I answered questions about the terrain and wildlife we might encounter. "Everyone get some rest," I said as we finished. "Tomorrow we start with equipment checks at 8, then head out for a practice hike to make sure your boots are broken in and your packs are adjusted properly." The students collected their things, voices low with travel fatigue but excited about the days ahead. I noticed Vanessa walking alongside Dave as they left the common room, her head tilted toward him as she asked something about his camera gear. Morning came with the crisp air and golden light that make the Rockies so magical in early September. After a quick breakfast in the hostel dining area, We gathered in the parking lot to check equipment. I moved from student to student, examining their boots, adjusting pack straps, and making sure everyone knew how to use their gear properly. "Your hip belt needs to be tighter," I told a girl named Emma, helping her adjust the straps on her backpack. "You want the weight on your hips, not your shoulders." Across the parking lot, Vanessa was working with a group of male students. She stood close to John Parker as she helped him organize his pack, her hand resting on his arm while she pointed out how to distribute weight properly. When she moved to help Dave adjust his shoulder straps, she stepped directly behind him, reaching around to tug at the buckles near his chest. "Let me get that for you," she said, her voice carrying across the parking lot. She stayed pressed against his back longer than necessary, and I saw Dave shift his weight, taking a small step forward to create space between them. It registered as slightly unprofessional, but nothing worth addressing. Some people were naturally more physical in their teaching style. As long as the students seemed comfortable enough, it wasn't my place to say anything. Our practice hike took us along a moderate trail that climbed several hundred feet above Jasper, offering spectacular views of the valley below. I kept the pace deliberately slow, watching how each student handled the incline and helping those who struggled with their breathing or pack adjustments. "Remember to pace yourselves," I called out as we climbed. "This isn't a race. Steady movement gets you there with energy to spare." Vanessa stayed near the front of the group, often switching positions to walk beside different male students. She laughed easily at their jokes, asked them personal questions, and maintained constant conversation. I noticed she paid particular attention to Dave and John, both athletic young men who handled the trail with confidence. During our lunch break at a scenic overlook, I watched the group dynamics more carefully. Most of the students sat in clusters, sharing trail mix and comparing notes on the plants and wildlife we'd seen during the morning. Vanessa moved between groups but spent most of her time with Dave, John, and 2 other male students. "The rock formations up here are incredible," she said, sitting down beside Dave. She leaned toward him to look at something on his camera screen, her shoulder pressing against his. Dave showed her the photos he'd taken, but I noticed how he subtly created space between them when she moved too close. Nothing dramatic, just the small adjustments people make when someone enters their personal bubble. The afternoon brought practical lessons in navigation, water purification, and basic first aid. I demonstrated how to use a compass and map together, then had the students practice in pairs. "Always know where you are and how to get back to a main trail," I explained. "Getting lost is the easiest way to turn a good trip bad." Vanessa paired herself with John for the navigation exercise, standing close as they bent over the map together. When it came time to practice water filtration, she partnered with Dave, touching his hands repeatedly as she showed him how to assemble the filter properly. The behavior struck me as unprofessional but not necessarily alarming. Some people were just naturally touchy. Most of the students seemed comfortable with her approach, though I caught Dave looking uncomfortable when Vanessa put her hand on his shoulder while he was adjusting his backpack straps later that afternoon. Back at the hostel that evening, I led a discussion about wildlife safety, particularly focused on bear encounters. Black bears will generally run away if they hear you coming, which is why we make noise on the trail, I explained. Grizzlies are more unpredictable. If you see a grizzly, stay calm, avoid eye contact, and back away slowly. Never run. The students asked good questions, showing they were taking the information seriously. Dave in particular seemed focused on the safety protocols, taking notes and asking about specific scenarios. I appreciated his attention to detail. It made my job easier when clients actually listened to safety briefings. After the meeting, most of the students headed into town for dinner at a local restaurant. I stayed behind to review our route for the next day, spreading maps across a table in the common room. Vanessa joined me after a while, sitting close enough that I could smell her shampoo. "The students are really connecting with you," she said, tracing our planned route with her finger. "They respect your experience." "That's good to hear," I replied, shifting slightly to create more space between us. Respect for the guide makes everything safer. Safety first, always, she agreed with a smile. That's what I keep telling them. She leaned forward to look more closely at the map, her arm pressing against mine. I moved my chair back an inch, making it look like I was just getting comfortable. 22 years of guiding had taught me how to create professional distance without making things awkward. Vanessa seemed to take the hint and sat back in her chair. Our second day in Jasper focused on more advanced skills, proper campsite selection, food storage techniques to avoid attracting bears, and emergency signaling. We hiked to a different location, a beautiful meadow surrounded by pine forest, and practiced setting up tents and tarps. Your tent needs to be on high ground, I explained to the group as they searched for suitable spots. Look for flat areas where water won't pool if it rains. The students spread out across the meadow in their assigned pairs, working together to set up their shelters. Vanessa moved from group to group, offering help and suggestions. Again, I noticed how she positioned herself near the male students, particularly Dave and John. She would lean in close when asking questions, touch their arms when making points, and find excuses to partner with them during equipment checks. During the tarp setup demonstration, Vanessa asked Dave to help her hold one corner while she secured another. They worked well together, but I saw how she found reasons to brush against him as they adjusted the tarp, her hand lingering on his wrist as she showed him how to tighten the corner knot. After lunch, we practiced what to do in emergency situations, everything from minor injuries to serious trauma. The students paired up to bandage simulated wounds and create improvised stretchers. In remote areas, you need to be ready to help each other, I told them. Medical help can be hours or even days away, depending on where we are. Vanessa volunteered to be a victim for the stretcher exercise, lying on the ground while Dave and John figured out how to lift and carry her safely. She laughed as they struggled to keep the stretcher level, her hand gripping Dave's arm when they finally managed to lift her. The day ended with a comprehensive review of our route into Banff National Park. Back at the hostel, we gathered in the common room with maps spread across several tables. We'll hike to Lake Minnewanka tomorrow, I explained, tracing the route with my finger. It's about 12 miles of moderate terrain. We'll set up a base camp there and spend 3 days exploring the surrounding backcountry before heading out. The students asked questions about the lake and what wildlife we might see. I could sense their excitement building as the real adventure drew closer. Lake Minnewanka is one of the most beautiful spots in Banff, I told them. The water is this incredible blue-green color, and the mountains rise straight up from the shore. Great place for photography, I added, nodding toward Dave, who smiled in appreciation. After finalizing our departure time and last-minute gear adjustments, I went over emergency procedures one final time, emphasizing the importance of staying with the group. Out there, we follow 3 simple rules, I said, making eye contact with each student. Stay together, communicate clearly, and follow instructions without question. Your safety depends on it. The students nodded solemnly. Even the most casual among them seemed to understand the seriousness of backcountry travel. As the meeting broke up, everyone began preparing for our early departure. Some students headed to their rooms to pack, while others went into town for last-minute supplies. I stayed behind to double-check my own gear and review the weather forecast one more time. Through the window, I saw Vanessa talking quietly with Dave near the van in the parking lot. The conversation looked intense, with Vanessa standing very close to him, gesturing with her hands as she spoke. Dave kept glancing around as if checking whether anyone was watching them. His body language showed clear discomfort. Shoulders tight, weight shifted away from her, eyes darting around. I frowned and walked toward the door, concerned enough to check what was happening. As I approached, Vanessa immediately stepped back from Dave and turned toward me with a bright smile. "James, we were just discussing tomorrow's weather," she said with forced cheerfulness. Dave was worried about his camera gear if it rains. Dave nodded without making eye contact, his hands busy adjusting straps on his backpack. "Yeah, Just checking about rain covers and stuff." "Forecast looks clear for tomorrow," I said, looking between them. "But always good to be prepared." Dave mumbled something about needing to finish packing and walked quickly toward the hostel entrance. Vanessa stayed behind, still smiling as if nothing unusual had happened. "The students are really excited about getting to the lake," she said, falling into step beside me as I walked back toward the hostel. "Everyone's packed and ready for an early start." I nodded, watching Dave's retreating figure as he disappeared into the building. Something about that interaction didn't sit right with me, but I couldn't put my finger on exactly what was wrong. I made a mental note to keep a closer eye on their interactions once we were on the trail. I slept restlessly that night, my mind returning to the tense interaction I'd witnessed between Dave and Vanessa in the parking lot. Something about their body language had set off warning bells, but without anything concrete to act on, I told myself to just keep a closer eye on them during our hike the next day. Morning came early. I was up before sunrise, checking weather reports and making final preparations, while the students grabbed breakfast in the hostel dining room. Everyone seemed excited about finally heading into the back country after 2 days of training and practice hikes. "Bags in the van in 15 minutes, I called out as I walked through the dining area. "We've got a full day of hiking ahead." The students hurried to finish their meals and gather their gear. I noticed Dave sitting alone at a corner table, picking at his food without much enthusiasm. When Vanessa entered the room, his shoulders tensed visibly, and he quickly stood up to bus his tray. We loaded the van and drove to our trailhead at the eastern edge of Banff National Park. The morning air carried the sweet scent of pine as I helped unload backpacks and distribute group supplies. Everyone seemed eager to get moving, with even the less experienced hikers adjusting their packs with newfound confidence after our practice days. "Circle up for a minute," I said once everyone was ready. The students gathered around me, adjusting straps and checking water bottles. "Today we're hiking 12 miles to Lake Minnewanka. The trail gains about 1,500 feet of elevation over the first half, then levels out as we approach the lake. We'll take regular breaks, but pace yourselves. Any questions?" A few hands went up with typical pre-hike concerns about bathroom breaks and wildlife sightings. I answered each one patiently, noting how Dave stood at the back of the group, keeping several students between himself and Vanessa, who had positioned herself near the front. "Let's move out," I said, shouldering my pack. "Stay together, keep an eye on each other, and remember to make noise in thick brush areas. Bears don't like surprises." I took the lead position with Vanessa close behind me. The trail started off wide and well-maintained, winding through dense forest that occasionally opened to reveal stunning views of the surrounding mountains. The students spread out in a loose line, talking among themselves as we settled into a steady hiking rhythm. "Beautiful morning for a hike," Vanessa said, matching my pace. "The students are excited about finally getting to the lake." "It's worth the walk," I replied, keeping my tone professional. "One of the most scenic spots in the park. I can't wait to see it," she said, smiling. Then she dropped back to walk beside John Parker, her hand brushing his arm as she pointed out a hawk circling overhead. For the next few hours, I watched her move through the line of students like a social butterfly, rarely spending more than 15 minutes with the same person. But I couldn't help noticing a pattern in her movements. She consistently gravitated toward the male students, especially Dave and John, finding reasons to walk beside them, help adjust their equipment, or share observations about the scenery. When Dave saw her approaching him around mid-morning, he quickened his pace to catch up with me at the front of the line. "Mind if I ask you some questions about the area?" he said, glancing back over his shoulder. "Not at all," I replied, recognizing his tactic for what it was. "What would you like to know?" He asked thoughtful questions about the geology and wildlife of the region, showing genuine interest while maintaining his position near me as we hiked. Behind us, I saw Vanessa's brief look of frustration before she turned her attention to another male student. Around noon, we reached a small creek that cut across the trail. The clear water bubbled over smooth rocks, creating a perfect spot for our lunch break. 30 minutes here," I announced, setting my pack down on a flat boulder. Good place to refill water bottles and rest your legs before the last push. The students scattered along the creek bank, some pulling out water filters while others found comfortable spots to sit and eat their trail lunches. I moved among them, checking for signs of fatigue or blisters, making sure everyone was drinking enough water. As I was helping a student named Emma adjust her water filter, I saw Dave approach from the corner of my eye. He looked nervous, glancing around to make sure no one was within earshot. "James, can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked quietly. "Somewhere private?" I nodded, finishing up with Emma's filter. "Let's check the trail ahead," I suggested, pointing upstream where a bend in the creek would take us out of sight from the rest of the group. We walked silently until we were well away from the others. Dave kept looking back, his shoulders tense as he ran his hand through his sandy hair. "What's on your mind?" I asked, stopping where the creek widened into a small pool. Dave took a deep breath, looking down at his boots. "It's about Vanessa," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of running water. "She's been making me really uncomfortable." My stomach tightened. I'd had my suspicions based on what I'd observed, but hearing it confirmed made it real. "Tell me what's happening," I said, keeping my voice calm and neutral. "Last night, after everyone went to bed, she knocked on my hotel room door," Dave explained, still not meeting my eyes. "She said she wanted to talk about some biology questions for..." The students were still loading their gear into the van when Dave approached me, his eyes darting nervously toward the hostel entrance. "I didn't get a chance to finish telling you," he said in a low voice. "Vanessa came to my room last night. She said she wanted to talk about the trip, but then she started getting personal." My jaw tightened. "How personal?" She put her hand on my leg and started asking if I had a girlfriend back home. When I told her about Sarah, she just smiled and said, "She's not here, though." Dave ran his hand through his hair. I made an excuse about needing to pack and practically pushed her out the door. "Has she done this before?" I asked, keeping my voice down as other students passed by. "Little things, touching my arm, standing too close. I thought maybe that's just how she is with everyone, but last night crossed a line." I nodded, anger building in my chest. "You did the right thing telling me. I'll keep an eye on the situation." "Please don't make it obvious," Dave said quickly. "I still have to take her class next semester." Before I could respond, Vanessa walked up, smiling brightly as if nothing was wrong. "Ready for our big adventure, guys?" she asked, adjusting her backpack straps. "Just finishing up," I said, meeting her eyes directly. Dave was asking about our campsite at Lake Minnewanka. She glanced between us, her smile faltering slightly before she recovered. "It's supposed to be gorgeous. I can't wait to see it." The drive to our trailhead took just under an hour. Students chatted excitedly in the back of the van while I mentally reworked our camping arrangements. What Dave had told me wasn't just unprofessional, it was predatory. A faculty member, even a teaching assistant, making advances on a student violated every ethical standard in academia. At the trailhead, I gathered the group for final instructions before we set off toward Lake Minnewanka. The 12-mile hike would take most of the day, and I wanted everyone focused on the trail ahead rather than interpersonal drama. The hike itself was spectacular. Our path wound through dense pine forests that occasionally opened to reveal vast mountain vistas. Massive peaks rose around us, still holding patches of snow on their northern faces despite the September warmth. The air felt clean and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and wild grasses. I kept the group moving at a steady pace, stopping regularly for water and rest breaks. Throughout the day, I made sure to position myself between Dave and Vanessa whenever possible. She seemed to sense my interference, giving me questioning looks when I'd suddenly appear beside Dave during rest stops or rearrange the hiking order after breaks. "Everything okay?" she asked during our lunch stop by a small mountain stream. "You seem tense today." "Just focused on getting everyone to camp before dark," I replied, purposely keeping my tone neutral. As we neared Lake Minnewanka in the late afternoon, The trees thinned and gave way to a spectacular view of the water. The lake stretched before us like a long blue ribbon tucked between mountain walls, its surface reflecting the peaks in perfect mirror image. Even after 22 years of guiding in these mountains, the sight still took my breath away. "Wow," one of the students whispered, stopping in her tracks. "Worth the walk?" I asked, smiling at their awed expressions. We reached the lakeshore with about 2 hours of daylight left, perfect timing to set up camp before darkness fell. The campsite sat on a flat area about 30 yards from the water's edge, with established fire rings and plenty of space for our tents. "Let's get camp set up," I called out as everyone dropped their packs with grateful sighs. "Tents first, then we'll worry about dinner." This was when I needed to implement the changes I'd been planning all day. Normally, students chose their own tent partners, but I had a responsibility to ensure everyone's safety and comfort. "I'm going to assign tent groups," I announced, pulling out my notebook. The students looked surprised, but didn't question it. "Emma, Lisa, and Vanessa. You'll take the large tent near the fire ring. John, Dave, and Miguel in the tent to the right. The rest of you split between the remaining 2 tents as we discussed earlier." I watched Vanessa's reaction carefully. Her smile slipped for just a moment before she composed herself. "I thought the faculty chaperone usually gets their own tent," she said lightly. "Usually, yes," I replied. "But we're tight on space with this particular campsite, and I need the smallest tent for gear storage." It wasn't true, but it sounded plausible enough. I half expected her to challenge me, but she just shrugged and picked up her pack. "Whatever works," she said, heading toward the assigned tent area. The students scattered to set up their shelters for the night. I kept a careful eye on everyone while preparing my own small tent, noting how Vanessa worked mechanically with Emma and Lisa, her earlier enthusiasm seemingly dampened. Once the tents were up, I organized the cooking rotation. 3 students were assigned to prepare dinner while others gathered firewood or filtered water from the lake. Vanessa stood near the fire pit, watching Dave as he helped John set up a cooking tarp in case of rain. "Vanessa," I called, "could you help organize the food bags? We need to inventory what we're using tonight versus what needs to go in the bear hang." She turned toward me slowly, almost reluctantly pulling her gaze away from Dave. "Sure," she said, her voice flat. As dinner preparations continued, I noticed how Vanessa's behavior shifted further. The animated, engaging teaching assistant from our first days seemed to have disappeared. She became increasingly quiet, her movements stiff and distracted. When a student asked her where to find the salt for the pasta, she snapped, "How should I know? Ask James." The student looked taken aback by her tone, and I stepped in quickly. "It's in the small blue stuff sack with the other spices," I said, giving Vanessa a questioning look that she ignored. Dusk settled over the lake as we gathered around the campfire for dinner. The mountains created a dramatic silhouette against the darkening sky, and the first stars appeared overhead. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a perfect evening in the backcountry. Vanessa barely touched her food, pushing pasta around her plate while staring across the fire at Dave. Her focus on him was so intense that several students noticed, exchanging uncomfortable glances when they thought no one was looking. Dave kept his attention firmly on his food or on conversations with students sitting near him, carefully avoiding eye contact with Vanessa. After dinner, I gathered everyone for a brief meeting about the next day's activities. "We'll split into 2 groups tomorrow," I explained. "One group will hike along the north shore to explore some geological features, and the other will study plant adaptations in the alpine zone above camp." As I spoke, I noticed Vanessa's eyes never left Dave. She wasn't even pretending to listen to me, which was unprofessional and increasingly concerning. When I assigned her to lead the plant study group and put Dave with my geology group, her head snapped toward me. "I should go with the geology group," she said sharply. "It's more relevant to what the students are studying this semester." "Your specialty is alpine ecology, right?" I asked, knowing full well it was from her introduction when we first met. "The students will benefit more from your expertise in that area." Her jaw tightened visibly, but she didn't argue further. As the meeting broke up and students drifted toward their tents or back to the fire, I pulled Dave aside. Stay with the group tonight, I said quietly. Don't go anywhere alone. He nodded, understanding what I meant without needing elaboration. Thanks for switching the groups tomorrow. No problem. Try to get some rest. While the students cleaned up after dinner, I began preparing our food storage for the night. Banff National Park had strict regulations about food in bear country. Everything with a scent needed to be hung from trees, well away from our sleeping area. I collected food bags, cooking equipment, and toiletries, then walked about 70 yards from camp to a spot with suitable trees for a bear hang. The forest was dark beyond the reach of my headlamp, the tall pines creating deep shadows between brief patches of moonlight. As I was setting up the rope system for the hang, I heard something moving in the underbrush beyond the trees. I paused, listening carefully. 22 years in the backcountry had taught me to recognize the sounds of different animals, the heavy tread of moose, the careful steps of deer, the occasional huffing of bears. This sound was different, not the methodical movement of a large animal foraging, but something more erratic. I heard branches snapping, then what sounded like digging, followed by a low, rumbling growl. My first thought was bear, possibly drawn by food smells from our camp. I reached for the bear spray on my belt and turned my headlamp to its brightest setting. "Hey, bear!" I called out firmly, the standard warning to let bears know humans were present. Most bears want nothing to do with people and will move away once they know you're there. The sound stopped momentarily, then resumed with greater intensity. The growling grew louder, interspersed with what sounded like grunting. Concerned, I moved cautiously toward the noise, making sure to announce my presence with heavy footsteps and occasional calls. About 50 yards from where I'd been setting up the bear hang, my headlamp beam caught movement on the ground. What I saw made me stop short. Vanessa was on her hands and knees, frantically digging at the forest floor. Her fingers clawed at the dirt and pine needles with manic energy, throwing soil between her legs like a dog digging a hole. The growling sounds I'd heard were coming from her. "Vanessa?" I called, confusion mixing with a creeping sense of dread. She froze at the sound of my voice but didn't turn around. Her back rose and fell with rapid breathing. I took a step closer, swinging my headlamp beam directly onto her. "Vanessa, what are you doing out here?" When she finally turned toward me, the beam caught her eyes, which reflected the light back with an animal-like glow. Her face was smeared with dirt and something dark and wet that looked like blood. It covered her mouth and chin, dripping onto her shirt. "Are you hurt?" I asked, moving closer out of instinct to help. She didn't respond with words. Instead, she made a guttural sound, deep in her throat that raised the hair on the back of my neck. It wasn't a sound I'd ever heard from a human before. "Vanessa," I said more firmly, "what's wrong? Talk to me." Her head tilted at an odd angle as she studied me, more like a predator assessing prey than a person listening to a question. Then, without warning, she lunged toward me. I stumbled backward, barely avoiding her as she snapped her teeth where my arm had been seconds before. The movement was shockingly fast and utterly inhuman. She landed on all fours, then immediately sprang up and charged at me again. I dropped the bear spray in my panic and scrambled backward, tripping over a fallen log. Vanessa missed me by inches, her teeth clacking together audibly as they closed on empty air. She crashed headlong into the underbrush, disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of my fallen headlamp. I stood frozen, my breath coming in short gasps as I strained to hear where she had gone. The forest had gone completely silent. No movement, no growling. Just the soft rustle of pine needles in the night breeze. My mind struggled to process what I'd just witnessed. This wasn't a mental health crisis or a psychological break, at least not like any I'd ever heard of. Vanessa had moved and sounded like something wild, something predatory. The image of her dirt-streaked face and reflecting eyes burned in my memory as I stood motionless, listening to the darkness around me. I ran back to camp as fast as the dark forest allowed, tripping twice over exposed roots hidden in shadow. My headlamp beam bounced wildly ahead of me, creating disorienting patterns through the trees. 22 years in the wilderness had taught me to trust my instincts, and everything inside me screamed danger. The glow of our campfire appeared through the trees. Most of the students had already gone to their tents, with only a few still sitting around the dying flames. I slowed my approach, not wanting to cause immediate panic. My mind raced through options. We needed to evacuate, but hiking out at night through bear country wasn't safe either. I spotted Dave and John still awake, talking quietly by the fire. I made my way directly to them, keeping my voice low. "We need to leave, now." I knelt between them, glancing back toward the dark trees where I'd left Vanessa. "What's wrong?" Dave asked, immediately alert. "It's Vanessa. Something's wrong with her." I struggled to find words that wouldn't sound insane. "She attacked me in the woods." John's eyes widened. "Attacked you? What do you mean?" "No time to explain everything. We need to wake everyone up and stick together." I looked toward the other tents where students were sleeping. "Help me get—" A twig snapped at the edge of our camp. All three of us turned toward the sound. Vanessa stood at the boundary where firelight met darkness. She looked nothing like the polished teaching assistant from earlier that day. Her clothes were torn and filthy. Dirt and pine needles matted her hair. Both hands were caked with soil and what I now clearly recognized as blood. The same dark substance dripped from her mouth and chin, glistening in the firelight. "Oh my God," John whispered. Most disturbing was how she moved. Her head jerked in small, rapid movements as her eyes darted between us. Her body seemed to twitch and spasm randomly, like someone fighting against their own muscles. "Vanessa?" Dave called, standing slowly. "Are you hurt?" She focused on him instantly, her head snapping in his direction. The movement was too quick, too mechanical for a normal human reaction. She made that same guttural sound I'd heard in the forest, a deep, rumbling growl that shouldn't have come from a human throat. "Back up slowly," I said, keeping my voice steady while reaching for the fire. "Don't make any sudden moves." Dave took a cautious step backward. Vanessa's body tensed like a sprinter before the gun. What happened next was too fast for me to prevent. Vanessa launched herself forward in a blur of movement, crossing the 15 feet between her and Dave in an instant. She slammed into him with enough force to knock him flat on his back, straddling his chest before either John or I could react. Dave's scream cut through the night as Vanessa drove her teeth into his shoulder. The sound jolted me into action. I grabbed a burning log from the fire, ignoring the heat searing my palm, and swung it at Vanessa's back. The flaming wood connected with a solid thud. Sparks flew as she released Dave with a high-pitched shriek that sounded more animal than human. She spun toward me with impossible speed, her bloodied face contorted in rage, teeth bared. "Get Dave!" I shouted to John, keeping the burning log between Vanessa and myself. John rushed to Dave, who was clutching his shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. The firelight showed something else mixed with the blood, a dark, viscous fluid that seemed to be coming from the bite itself. "Come on, man," John said, trying to help Dave to his feet. The movement drew Vanessa's attention instantly. She whirled away from me, seemingly forgetting I existed, and lunged at John. I swung the log again, but missed. Vanessa tackled John to the ground with the same frightening strength she'd shown with Dave. Her teeth sank into his neck before I could pull her off. John's scream woke the camp. Students emerged from tents, their confusion turning to terror at the scene before them. Some froze in shock while others began screaming. The peaceful mountain night erupted into chaos. I dropped the burning log and grabbed Vanessa from behind, wrapping my arms around her torso to drag her off John. She fought with strength that seemed impossible for her size, twisting and snapping her teeth at my arms. "Get back in the tents," I shouted to the panicking students. "Now!" John lay on the ground, one hand pressed to his neck where Vanessa had bitten him. Even in the uncertain light of the fire, I could see the dark substance from her mouth mixing with his blood, spreading outward from the wound like ink in water. The blackness seemed to move under his skin, tracing along his veins. I struggled to maintain my grip on Vanessa. She writhed and twisted like nothing human, her spine bending at angles that shouldn't have been possible. Her nails, which now looked more like claws, raked across my forearm, leaving deep gashes. "Help me!" Dave called weakly from where he'd collapsed near the fire. He'd managed to sit up, but his face had gone pale. He pulled his hand away from his shoulder, revealing his wound. What I saw made my blood run cold. The bite mark on his shoulder was already surrounded by the same dark discoloration affecting John. Black veins spread outward from the wound, visible even through his torn shirt. The infection, or whatever it was spreading before my eyes. Vanessa suddenly went limp in my arms, a tactic that caught me off guard. As my grip loosened, she dropped to all fours and scrambled away with that same jerking, unnatural movement. She circled the edge of the firelight, her head twitching as she surveyed the camp. Several students had ignored my orders and stood frozen near their tents, watching in horror. I needed to get everyone together where I could protect them. "Everyone to the large tent," I shouted, pointing to the 8-person tent we used for gear storage. "Move now." 2 students rushed to help Dave while I went to John. His eyes were open but unfocused, and his skin burned with fever when I touched his forehead. The black veins had already spread from his neck across his collarbone and up toward his jaw. "John, can you hear me?" I asked, shaking him gently. He mumbled something incoherent, his eyes rolling back slightly. I hooked my arms under his shoulders and began dragging him toward the large tent where the others were gathering. The effort sent pain shooting through the gashes on my arm, but adrenaline kept me moving. Vanessa paced at the edge of camp, occasionally darting forward a few steps before retreating again. Her movements reminded me of a wolf testing the defenses of its prey, looking for weakness. I kept one eye on her as I pulled John towards safety. "James!" someone screamed. "She's coming again!" Vanessa had changed direction, charging straight toward us with that same frightening speed. I couldn't drop John to defend myself, and we were still 10 feet from the tent. One of the male students, Miguel, I think, grabbed a pot from beside the fire and hurled it at Vanessa. The heavy cooking pot caught her in the shoulder, knocking her off balance just long enough for me to drag John the remaining distance to the tent. "Get him inside," I shouted, passing John's limp form to the students at the tent entrance. I snatched up the burning log I'd dropped earlier. The flames had died down, but the end still glowed red with embers. Vanessa had recovered and was watching me with those unnaturally reflective eyes. "Stay back," I warned, swinging the log in a wide arc. She snarled, showing teeth stained black with that same viscous fluid. For a moment we stood facing each other, me with my makeshift weapon, her with whatever inhuman strength and speed had overtaken her body. "James, hurry!" Dave called weakly from inside the tent. I backed toward the tent entrance, keeping the smoldering log between myself and Vanessa. She paced back and forth, occasionally feinting forward only to retreat when I swung the log at her. I could see her calculating, waiting for me to make a mistake. When I reached the tent, I kept my eyes on Vanessa while feeling behind me for the opening. "I'm coming in," I said to the students inside. "Be ready to zip it closed immediately." As I backed through the entrance, Vanessa suddenly charged, moving faster than seemed possible. I thrust the burning end of the log directly at her face. She veered away with a shriek, giving me just enough time to dive into the tent. The students yanked the zipper closed behind me. Inside, 12 terrified faces looked back at me in the beam of someone's headlamp. Dave sat propped against backpacks, his face ashen, while John lay unconscious on the floor, his chest rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. "What's happening?" Emma asked, her voice breaking with fear. "What's wrong with Vanessa?" "I don't know," I admitted, turning to examine Dave's wound. The bite on his shoulder looked even worse up close. The skin around it had turned an angry red, with black veins spreading outward like cracks in glass. Dave winced when I touched the skin near the wound. "It burns," he said through gritted teeth, "like fire under my skin." Outside, we could hear Vanessa moving around the tent, her footsteps accompanied by that same guttural growling. Something scraped against the tent fabric, her nails, or perhaps her teeth. "We need to barricade the entrance," I said, looking around at our limited options. "Use sleeping bags, backpacks, anything you can find." The students moved quickly, piling gear against the tent door while I checked on John. His condition had deteriorated rapidly. Dark veins now covered most of his neck and had spread across his cheek and forehead. His skin burned with fever, and his breathing had become erratic. "James," Dave said weakly, "what's happening to us?" I looked from his infected wound to John's unconscious form. Nothing in my wilderness first aid training had prepared me for this. Whatever was affecting them wasn't a normal infection. It was spreading too fast, changing them too quickly. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but we're going to get you both help." "It's in me," Dave whispered, staring at the black veins on his arm. "I can feel it moving." A scratching sound drew our attention to the side of the tent. Vanessa's shadow was visible through the fabric, her form distorted and hunched as she moved around our shelter. "She's testing for weak points," I said quietly, "looking for a way in." The students huddled closer together, as far from the tent walls as possible. Someone was crying softly, the sound barely audible over Vanessa's growling outside. "We need to call for help," Lisa said, her voice shaking. "Can't we use the emergency radio?" "It's in my tent," I replied, "on the other side of camp." For the next hour, we sat in tense silence, listening to Vanessa circling our tent. Occasionally, she would claw at the fabric or throw herself against the sides, causing the students to gasp or cry out in fear. Each time, she would pause as if gauging our reaction before continuing her predatory patrol. John's condition worsened by the minute. The black veins had spread across his entire face and down his chest. His breathing became more labored, and occasionally his body would twitch violently. Dave wasn't much better. The infection from his shoulder wound had spread down his arm and across his chest. He remained conscious but grew weaker, his eyes glazed with pain. "My head," he mumbled. "Everything's loud. Too bright." Around midnight, John began convulsing. His back arched off the ground, his limbs rigid and shaking. I rolled him onto his side, making sure he couldn't swallow his tongue, but otherwise there was little I could do. The seizure lasted nearly a minute before John went completely still. I pressed my fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. "Is he—" Emma couldn't finish the question. I nodded grimly. "He's gone." Quiet sobs filled the tent. Outside, Vanessa's growling suddenly intensified, as if she somehow sensed what had happened. I covered John's body with a sleeping bag, trying to give him some dignity, while protecting the other students from having to look at him. Dave watched with growing horror, no doubt seeing his own fate in John's still form. "That's going to happen to me, isn't it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before I could answer, a commotion outside caught our attention. Vanessa's growls had changed pitch, becoming more frenzied. We could hear her circling the tent faster, her movements more agitated. 20 minutes later, a scream cut through the tense silence as John's body suddenly jerked under the sleeping bag. Several students scrambled backward in panic. "He moved!" someone shouted. "I saw him move!" "That's impossible," I said, reaching for the sleeping bag. "He doesn't have a pulse." As I pulled back the cover, John's eyes snapped open. They were bloodshot with the same unnatural, reflective quality I'd seen in Vanessa's eyes. Before I could react, he sat upright with a jerking motion that no living person would make. "Get back!" I shouted, pushing the nearest students away from him. John's head twitched as he surveyed the tent. his movements identical to Vanessa's, jerky, mechanical, inhuman. When his gaze landed on the student closest to him, his lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing teeth already stained with that same dark fluid. I realized with sickening clarity what was happening. Whatever had infected Vanessa had spread to John through his bite wound. Now John had died and come back as something else, something that wasn't human anymore. And Dave, watching with horrified recognition in his eyes, was already partway through the same transformation. I grabbed my knife from its sheath on my belt, gripping it tightly as John began to move. The students pressed themselves against the far side of the tent as far from John as possible. Outside, Vanessa's frenzied movements continued, her growls mixing with John's as he fixed his gaze on the closest student. I placed myself between them, knife raised, knowing I might have to make an impossible choice to protect the others. As John prepared to lunge, Vanessa's growls outside grew louder, more excited. It was as if she could sense her newly created kin awakening inside our shelter. John's muscles tensed, ready to spring, while I braced myself for what might be the hardest decision of my life. "Everyone to the large tent!" I shouted again, my voice cutting through the chaos of screams and panic. The burning log in my hand was more ember than flame now, but it still kept Vanessa at bay as she paced at the edge of the firelight. 2 students rushed to help Dave while I dragged John toward the 8-person gear tent. His skin burned against mine, fever already raging through his system. Black veins spread from the bite on his neck, tracing a dark web across his skin that seemed to move and pulse. "Faster!" I called to the students, still frozen in shock. "Get everything you can carry and get inside." Vanessa charged forward suddenly, her body moving in that horrible jerking motion. I swung the log in a wide arc, forcing her back. She snarled, lips pulled back to reveal teeth stained with that black substance that dripped from her mouth. The gashes on my arm throbbed as I hauled John the final few yards to the tent. Several students reached out, grabbing his shoulders and pulling him inside. I backed toward the entrance, keeping my eyes locked on Vanessa. She circled like a wolf, testing for weakness, occasionally rushing forward only to retreat when I swung the smoldering log. "James, hurry!" someone called from inside. I felt behind me for the tent opening. "I'm coming in. Be ready to zip it closed immediately." The moment I sensed the opening, I backed through it, still facing outward. Vanessa charged again with that impossible speed. I thrust the ember end directly at her face, buying just enough time to tumble backward into the tent. Hands grabbed my jacket, yanking me fully inside as the zipper closed with a metallic rasp. 12 terrified faces stared back at me in the beam of someone's headlamp. Dave sat propped against backpacks, face gray with pain, while John lay unconscious on the tent floor, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. "What's wrong with her?" Emma asked, her voice breaking. "Why is she doing this?" "I don't know," I said honestly, turning to examine Dave's wound. The bite on his shoulder looked worse up close. The skin around it had turned angry red, with those same black veins spreading outward from the punctures. Dave winced when I touched the skin near the wound. "It burns," he said through clenched teeth, "like fire under my skin." Outside, Vanessa moved around the tent, her footsteps accompanied by that guttural growling. Something scraped against the fabric, claws or teeth, I couldn't tell which. "She's looking for a way in," I said quietly. "We need to barricade the entrance. Use sleeping bags, backpacks, anything." The students moved quickly, piling gear against the tent door while I checked on John. His condition had gotten worse in just minutes. Dark veins now covered most of his neck and had spread across his cheek and forehead. His skin burned against my palm, and his breathing had become uneven and labored. "James," Dave said weakly, "what's happening to us?" I looked from his infected wound to John's unconscious form. Nothing in my wilderness first aid training had prepared me for this. Whatever was affecting them wasn't a normal infection. It spread too fast, changed them too quickly. I don't know, I admitted, but we're going to get you both help. It's in me, Dave whispered, staring at the black veins creeping down his arm. I can feel it moving. A scratching sound drew our attention to the side of the tent. Vanessa's shadow was visible through the fabric, her form distorted and hunched as she circled our shelter. She's testing for weak points, I said, looking for a way in. The students huddled closer together, as far from the tent walls as possible. Someone was crying softly in the darkness. We need to call for help, Lisa said, her voice trembling. Can't we use the emergency radio? It's in my tent, I replied, on the other side of camp. I rummaged through my pockets, hoping for something useful. All I found was my Swiss Army knife, a headlamp, and a half-empty water bottle. I passed the water to Dave, who took a small sip before handing it back. How far to the nearest ranger station? Miguel asked. 8 miles, I said. Through difficult terrain, and we'd need to hike in darkness. That's better than staying here, he argued. Not with Vanessa out there, I countered. And we can't leave Dave and John. John moaned suddenly, his back arching off the ground. His eyes rolled beneath closed lids, and his fingers clawed at the tent floor. What's happening to him? Someone whispered. The infection's spreading, I said, though I had no real understanding of what we were facing. For the next hour, we sat in tense silence, listening to Vanessa circling our tent. Occasionally, she would claw at the fabric or throw herself against the sides, causing the students to gasp or cry out in fear. Each time she would pause, as if gauging our reaction before continuing her predatory patrol. I checked my watch. Just past 11. The night stretched ahead of us, dark and uncertain. John's condition worsened by the minute. The black veins had spread across his entire face and down his chest. His breathing became more labored, and occasionally his body would twitch violently. Dave wasn't much better. The infection from his shoulder wound had spread down his arm and across his chest. He remained conscious but grew weaker, his eyes glazed with pain. My head, he mumbled. Everything's loud, too bright. I tore strips from a clean t-shirt, using them to bind Dave's wound as best I could. The fabric turned black almost immediately, soaked through with that strange fluid seeping from the bite. This doesn't make sense, Emma whispered, watching me work. She was a biology major, if I remembered correctly. Infections don't spread this fast. This isn't a normal infection, I replied, tying off the makeshift bandage. Then what is it? She pressed. I had no answer that wouldn't sound insane. Around midnight, John began convulsing. His back arched off the ground, his limbs rigid and shaking. I rolled him onto his side, making sure he couldn't swallow his tongue, but otherwise there was little I could do. The seizure lasted nearly a minute before John went completely still. I pressed my fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. Is he... Emma couldn't finish the question. I nodded grimly. He's gone. Quiet sobs filled the tent. Outside, Vanessa's growling suddenly intensified, as if she somehow sensed what had happened. I covered John's body with a sleeping bag, trying to give him some dignity while protecting the other students from having to look at him. Dave watched with growing horror, no doubt seeing his own fate in John's still form. That's going to happen to me, isn't it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before I could answer, a commotion outside caught our attention. Vanessa's growls had changed pitch, becoming more frenzied. We could hear her circling the tent faster, her movements more agitated. Why is she getting worse? Lisa asked, pressing herself against the far side of the tent. I don't know, I said, though a terrible suspicion was forming in my mind. The minutes crawled by, each second marked by Vanessa's growls and the ragged breathing of terrified students. Dave's condition continued to deteriorate, the black veins now spreading up his neck toward his face. 20 minutes after John died, a student screamed as his body suddenly jerked under the sleeping bag. "He moved," Miguel shouted. "I saw him move." "That's impossible," I said, reaching for the covering. "He doesn't have a pulse." As I pulled back the sleeping bag, John's eyes snapped open. They were bloodshot, with the same unnatural, reflective quality I'd seen in Vanessa's eyes. Before I could react, he sat upright with a jerking motion that no living person would make. "Get back," I shouted, pushing the nearest students away from him. John's head twitched as he surveyed the tent, his movements identical to Vanessa's, jerky, mechanical, inhuman. When his gaze landed on the student closest to him, his lips pulled back in a snarl, revealing teeth already stained with that same dark fluid. I realized with sickening clarity what was happening. Whatever had infected Vanessa had spread to John through his bite wound. Now John had died and come back as something else, something that wasn't human anymore. And Dave, watching with horrified recognition in his eyes, was already partway through the same transformation. I grabbed my knife from its sheath on my belt, gripping it tightly as John began to move. The students pressed themselves against the far side of the tent, as far from John as possible. Outside, Vanessa's frenzied movements continued, her growls mixing with John's as he fixed his gaze on the closest student. I placed myself between them, knife raised, knowing I might have to make an impossible choice to protect the others. As John prepared to lunge, Vanessa's growls outside grew louder, more excited. It was as if she could sense her newly created kin awakening inside our shelter. John's muscles tensed, ready to spring, while I braced myself for what might be the hardest decision of my life. John lunged at Miguel, teeth bared and fingers curled into claws. I threw myself between them, tackling John with all my strength. We crashed into the side of the tent, the structure swaying dangerously as we rolled across sleeping bags and backpacks. Students screamed, scrambling away from our violent struggle. John was impossibly strong. His hands clawed at my jacket, trying to reach skin. I fought to pin his arms, but he twisted beneath me with unnatural flexibility. His teeth snapped inches from my face, that black substance spraying from his mouth as he snarled. We rolled again, knocking into the central support pole. John's head whipped back, striking the metal with a hollow crack that echoed through the tent. His body went instantly limp beneath me. I held him down for several seconds, waiting for him to move again. He didn't. Blood pooled beneath his head, mixing with the black fluid still leaking from his mouth. "Is he?" Emma whispered from the far side of the tent. I checked for a pulse and found nothing. "He's dead." Outside, the sounds had stopped. Vanessa's growls and scratching, which had been constant for hours, had vanished into the night. The sudden silence felt almost as threatening as her earlier presence. I listened intently, barely breathing as I tried to detect any movement beyond the tent walls. Nothing. "She's gone," I said, though I couldn't be sure. "We need to move while we have the chance." "Move where?" Lisa asked, her voice shaking. "It's the middle of the night." "To the ranger station, 8 miles away." I glanced at Dave, who was slumped against the backpacks, barely conscious. The black veins had spread up his neck and across his jaw. "We have injured people who need medical attention." "What about John?" someone asked. I looked at his body, knowing we couldn't bring him with us. "We need to leave him. The authorities will recover his body later." The words felt callous, but I had no choice. Our priority had to be the living. "Everyone grab only what you absolutely need," I instructed. "Water, some food, an extra layer, nothing else. We travel light and fast." I moved to Dave's side and gently shook his shoulder. "Dave, can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, glazed with pain and fever. "James, we're moving out. Can you walk if I help you?" He nodded weakly. "I think so." "What about her?" Emma asked, glancing toward the tent wall. "I'll check," I said, moving to the entrance. Everyone stay quiet and be ready to move the moment I say it's clear. I unzipped the tent just enough to peer out. The campsite was eerily still, illuminated only by the dying embers of our fire. I scanned slowly, looking for any movement in the shadows. Nothing stirred. "I don't see her," I whispered. "Get ready." The students gathered their minimal belongings while I helped Dave to his feet. He swayed dangerously, leaning heavily against me. "I've got you," I assured him, wrapping an arm around his waist. "My shoulder," he mumbled. "Feels like it's on fire." I unzipped the tent fully and stepped out, supporting Dave with one arm while my other hand held my knife. The pre-dawn air was cold and still, carrying the scent of pine and something else, a metallic, almost rotting smell that hadn't been there before. "Come on," I called softly to the students inside. "Move quickly, but quietly." They emerged one by one, eyes wide with fear as they scanned the darkness. Emma helped Lisa, who was still crying softly. Miguel took the lead, headlamp beam cutting through the darkness toward the trail. "Don't go too far ahead," I warned him. "We stay together." Dave stumbled beside me, each step requiring visible effort. "I can make it," he insisted when I looked concerned. I tore a strip from my shirt and used it to rebind his wound, which was seeping that black fluid through the earlier bandage. When I cleaned away some of the substance, I could see the bite marks clearly. They looked infected and inflamed, with the skin around them turning an unnatural gray. "We need to keep this clean," I said, though I suspected nothing would help what was happening to him. We moved away from camp in a tight group, headlamps illuminating the narrow trail that would take us back toward civilization. No one spoke. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made us freeze, listening for signs of pursuit. Dave's condition worsened with each passing mile. His skin burned with fever, and he leaned more heavily against me. The black veins had spread further, now visible at the edge of his jawline. His breathing grew labored, coming in short, pained gasps. "I need to rest," he whispered after we'd covered about 2 miles. I called a brief halt, helping Dave sit on a fallen log while the others gathered around. Dawn was breaking, pale light filtering through the trees. With visibility improving, I felt marginally safer, though I kept scanning the forest for any sign of Vanessa. 5 minutes, I told the group. "Drink water, eat something if you can." Most of them just stared blankly, too shocked or exhausted to feel hunger. Emma approached me, her voice low. "What was wrong with Vanessa?" she asked. "And John? People don't just change like that." "I don't know," I said honestly. "I've never seen anything like it." "It's spreading through Dave too," she observed. "Those black veins, they're the same as what happened to John." I nodded grimly. "Which is why we need to get him to a hospital as quickly as possible." Dave was watching us, his eyes clearer than they had been earlier. "I heard that," he said weakly. "Am I going to die like John did?" "No," I said firmly. "We're getting you help." But Dave had seen what happened to John, how he died and then came back as something else. The fear in his eyes told me he understood exactly what might be happening to him. After our brief rest, we continued moving. The trail grew steeper as we began climbing out of the lake basin. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a challenging but manageable hike. Now, with exhausted, traumatized students and Dave barely able to walk, our progress was painfully slow. The sun rose fully, burning away the morning mist. Birds began singing in the trees around us, creating a surreal contrast to the horror we'd just escaped. The world seemed to be carrying on as normal, unaware of how it had changed for us overnight. By mid-morning, Dave could no longer support his own weight. Miguel and I took turns carrying him between us. His skin was burning hot, and he drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling incoherently when awake. "Just a little farther," I encouraged the group as we crested a ridge. "The ranger station should be visible soon." Emma had taken charge of the other students, keeping them moving when they wanted to stop. She walked at the back of our line, making sure no one fell behind. I was grateful for her help. I couldn't have managed everyone alone. Finally, through a break in the trees, we spotted the ranger station, a small wooden building with a radio tower nestled in a clearing about half a mile ahead. Seeing our destination gave everyone a burst of energy. "We made it," Lisa said, tears of relief streaming down her face. We covered the remaining distance quickly, bursting into the station with the last of our strength. The lone ranger on duty jumped to his feet, shocked by our sudden appearance. 12 people, filthy and exhausted, supporting an unconscious young man between us. "What happened?" he demanded, moving quickly to help lower Dave onto a bench. "We were attacked at Lake Minnewanka," I explained, keeping to the simplified version I'd already decided on. "One student is dead, another is missing. This one needs immediate medical attention." The ranger moved with efficient urgency, not wasting time on unnecessary questions. He went straight to the radio, calling for emergency medical evacuation. I collapsed onto a chair, the adrenaline that had kept me going for hours finally wearing off. While the ranger made calls, I cleaned Dave's wound again and applied proper antiseptic from the station's first aid kit. The black veins had spread across his entire shoulder and chest, reaching his collarbone. The skin around the bite had turned a mottled gray-black. "Helicopters are on their way," the ranger announced, turning back to us. 2 hours, maximum. Now tell me exactly what happened." I gave him the edited version. Vanessa had suffered some kind of psychological break, becoming violent and attacking the students before disappearing into the wilderness. John had been killed during the attack. I left out the black fluid, the transformation after death, and the inhuman strength and speed they'd displayed. He took notes, asking for descriptions of Vanessa and the location of our campsite. When he asked what might have triggered her breakdown, I could only shake my head. "She seemed fine until yesterday evening," I said. Then everything changed. The ranger called the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who would coordinate the search for Vanessa and recovery of John's body. I provided them with GPS coordinates for our campsite. Dave stirred on the bench, his eyes fluttering open. "Where?" he began, his voice barely audible. "We're at the ranger station," I told him, kneeling beside him. "Help is coming." He grabbed my wrist with surprising strength, pulling me closer. "Something's wrong with me," he whispered. "I can feel it, changing me." "The doctors will figure it out," I assured him. "Just hang on." His eyes were clearer than they had been during the hike, focused intently on mine. If I become like them. "You have to." He didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. I nodded slightly, though I had no intention of following through on what he was asking. Dave seemed satisfied and released my wrist, closing his eyes again. The students sat in exhausted silence around the ranger station, some crying quietly, others staring blankly at nothing. The ranger provided water and emergency ration bars, but few had the appetite to eat. He worked the radio continuously, updating the incoming medical team on Dave's deteriorating condition. "The police want statements from all of you," he told us, "but that can wait until you've been checked out at the hospital." I nodded gratefully. The students were in no condition for interrogation. 2 hours later, we heard the distant thump of helicopter rotors. Everyone moved outside to watch 2 emergency medical helicopters descending into the clearing beside the station. Medical technicians jumped out, rushing toward us with equipment and stretchers. They went straight to Dave, checking his vitals and examining his wound. Their expressions grew concerned as they saw the extent of the infection. "How long ago was he bitten?" one asked me. "About 12 hours, I replied. The technician exchanged a look with his colleague. "And it's spread this far already?" "It's been aggressive," I said, choosing my words carefully. They loaded Dave onto a stretcher, inserting an IV into his arm. "We're taking him directly to isolation at Calgary General," the lead medic informed me. Whatever this infection is, it's unlike anything I've seen before. The second helicopter would transport the rest of us. The students were assessed quickly, treated for minor injuries and shock, then loaded aboard. I was the last to board, taking one final look at the wilderness behind us. Somewhere out there, Vanessa was still prowling, changed into something that wasn't human anymore. The helicopter lifted off, banking sharply toward Calgary. Through the window, I watched Dave's helicopter ahead of us, flying at maximum speed toward the hospital. I wondered if they would be able to stop the infection before it completed whatever transformation had claimed Vanessa and John. The students sat in silence during the flight, each lost in their own thoughts. Emma caught my eye, a question in her gaze that I couldn't answer. How do you explain something that defies explanation? We landed at Calgary General Hospital an hour later. Medical staff waited with wheelchairs and gurneys, rushing to assess everyone as we disembarked. Dave had already been taken inside, straight to an isolation ward where doctors in protective equipment surrounded his bed. The rest of us were separated into examination rooms. A doctor cleaned and bandaged the claw marks on my arm while asking about the incident. I repeated the same sanitized version I'd given the ranger. "And the student in isolation?" she asked. "What happened to him?" "He was bitten during the attack," I said. "The wound became infected quickly." She nodded, making notes in my chart. "The RCMP will want to speak with you once we've finished here." 2 officers were waiting when my examination was complete. They led me to a small conference room where I gave my statement again, answering their questions as truthfully as I could without mentioning anything that would sound unbelievable. "We have search teams headed to your campsite now," the lead officer informed me. "They'll recover the deceased student and search for the missing woman. She's dangerous," I warned. "If you find her, approach with extreme caution." The officer gave me an odd look. "We're trained to handle unstable individuals, Mr. Miller." Not like this, I thought. Not like what Vanessa had become. After the interview, I was allowed to check on the students. They had been placed in a common ward, receiving treatment for shock and minor injuries. Some parents had already been contacted and were flying in from Charleston. The university was sending representatives as well. A doctor stopped me before I could ask about Dave. "The student with the infected bite is in quarantine," she explained. "We're running tests to identify the pathogen, but it's unusual." "Will he recover?" I asked. She hesitated. "It's too early to say. The infection is advancing rapidly, and he's showing symptoms we haven't seen before. Elevated heart rate, extreme fever, sensitivity to light and sound. The same symptoms Dave had described in the tent before John transformed." "Can I see him?" I asked. "I'm afraid not. Strict quarantine protocols are in effect." She touched my arm sympathetically. "Get some rest, Mr. Miller. There's nothing more you can do right now." But as I walked away, I knew there was one thing I could do. I could tell the complete truth about what had happened. I could describe the black fluid, the transformation after death, the inhuman strength and speed. I could warn them about what Dave might become, and they would dismiss me as traumatized or delusional. They would sedate me, perhaps commit me for psychiatric evaluation, and no one would be prepared for what was happening to Dave. So I remained silent, watching from a distance as doctors in hazmat suits entered and exited the isolation ward where Dave fought against a transformation I couldn't begin to understand. The RCMP returned that evening with news. "We've recovered the deceased student's body," the officer informed me. "Search teams are still looking for the woman." "Have you noticed anything unusual about John's body?" I asked carefully. "That's not information I can share with you at this time," he replied, his expression giving nothing away. "The medical examiner will conduct a full investigation." I nodded, knowing they'd discover soon enough that John was not a normal corpse. I only hoped they would take proper precautions. As night fell, I sat alone in the hospital cafeteria, picking at food I couldn't taste. My mind kept returning to the horrific transformation we'd witnessed, Vanessa digging in the forest like an animal, John dying and coming back as something else, Dave slowly changing before our eyes. Something had infected them, something I'd never encountered in 22 years of wilderness guiding. Something that might now be spreading through Dave's body in an isolation ward just a few floors above me, and I had no idea how to stop it. 3 days passed in a blur of hospital rooms, police interviews, and fitful sleep interrupted by nightmares. I woke before dawn on the 4th day, disoriented in my sterile hospital room. The doctors had insisted on keeping me for observation despite my protests that I was physically fine. The scratches on my arm were minor compared to what Dave had suffered, but they were concerned about my mental state after witnessing a student's death. My phone buzzed on the bedside table. The screen showed an unknown Canadian number. "James Miller," I answered. "Mr. Miller, this is Sergeant Blackwood with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police." His voice sounded tired, as if he hadn't slept in days. "I'm calling to inform you that we've located the missing woman from your group." My hand tightened around the phone. "Vanessa Thompson?" "Yes. A search team found her body early this morning about 12 miles from your campsite." The word body hit me like a physical blow. Despite everything I'd seen her do, despite knowing she wasn't human anymore, hearing she was dead still shocked me. "What was her condition?" I asked carefully. "How did she die?" The line went quiet for a moment. "I'm not at liberty to discuss those details, Mr. Miller. The case has been transferred to federal authorities." "Federal? Why would they?" "Mr. Miller," he cut me off. "I'm calling as a courtesy to inform you that we've found her. That's all I can share. I should also advise you not to discuss the incident with anyone, especially media outlets." "I understand," I said, though I didn't. "What about the student? Dave Wilson?" "He remains hospitalized but stable. That's all I know." His tone made it clear the conversation was ending. "Someone will be by later today to take your final statement." After he hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process what I just heard. They'd found Vanessa 12 miles from camp, a considerable distance through difficult terrain. What had driven her to go so far? And why the secrecy about her condition? I dressed slowly, my body stiff from days of inactivity. Through my window, I could see Calgary's skyline against the morning sky. It looked impossibly normal, as if the world hadn't tilted on its axis 4 nights ago at Lake Minnewanka. A nurse arrived with breakfast I didn't want and news that a doctor would be checking me out later that morning. I thanked her and asked about the students. "Most of them were discharged yesterday," she said while checking my vitals. "Only you and the young man with the infection are still here." "Dave Wilson, how is he?" She glanced up from her chart. "I don't work in that ward, but I heard he's stabilized. Can I see him?" "You'd need to ask his doctor." She made a final note on her chart. "Dr. Sharma will be by around 10. When the doctor arrived, he was accompanied by a woman in a dark suit who introduced herself as Agent Lynn with Public Health Services. Her credentials looked official, but something about her manner made me doubt that was her actual role. Dr. Sharma examined the healing scratches on my arm while Agent Lynn watched from the corner. "These are healing nicely," he said. "No signs of infection. And how are you sleeping, Mr. Miller?" "Fine," I lied. He made a note on his tablet. "Any lingering anxiety, flashbacks?" "I'm a wilderness guide, doctor. I've dealt with emergencies before." "Not like this one," he said softly, and I noticed Agent Lynn shift her position slightly. "I'm processing it," I said. "I'd process it better at home." Dr. Sharma glanced at Agent Lynn, who gave a small nod. "I can discharge you today," he said, "but I'd recommend following up with a trauma counselor. What you experienced was traumatic, I know. I just wanted to leave, to get away from the sterile rooms and the endless questions. I'll look into counseling when I get home." Agent Lynn stepped forward. Before you leave, Mr. Miller, there are some administrative matters to address." Dr. Sharma excused himself, leaving me alone with her. She sat in the chair beside my bed and opened a slim briefcase. "I understand you've been informed about Ms. Thompson," she said. "Only that they found her body." She nodded. "The investigation is ongoing, but I can tell you the official report will classify this incident as a psychological break resulting in assault and 1 fatality." "That's not what happened," I said carefully. "Ms. Thompson's death will be attributed to exposure and injuries sustained during her flight into the wilderness." She continued as if I hadn't spoken. "Charleston University has arranged for the surviving students to complete their credits through alternative coursework." She removed a thick envelope and placed it on the bed. "This contains your payment for the expedition, along with some additional compensation for the trauma you experienced. I don't want... There's also a legal document requiring your signature." She pulled out another envelope, this one thinner. "It stipulates that you will not discuss specific details of the trip with anyone not directly involved in the investigation." I stared at the envelope. "You want me to sign a non-disclosure agreement about what really happened out there?" Her expression remained neutral. "About the incident as described in the official report." "And if I refuse?" "That would complicate matters for everyone involved." She placed a pen on top of the envelope. "Especially for the students who are trying to move forward from this tragedy." I thought about Dave, still in the hospital with whatever was spreading through his system, about the other students who had witnessed things no one would believe, about John's family, who deserved the truth about their son's death. But what truth could I give them? That their son had been infected by something unknown, died and came back as something inhuman. That Vanessa had transformed into a predatory creature that attacked with unnatural strength and speed. No one would believe me. They'd say I was traumatized, delusional. I'd lose my guiding license, my livelihood, my credibility. I took the pen and signed. Agent Lynn collected the document with a small smile. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Miller. A car will take you back to your cabin when you're ready." After she left, I sat holding the payment envelope. It felt heavy with more than just money, with complicity in whatever cover-up was happening around us. I was discharged that afternoon. Before leaving, I tried once more to see Dave. I went to the quarantine floor where I'd last seen him being taken, but the nurse at the station stopped me. "I'm sorry, Mr. Miller. Mr. Wilson isn't allowed visitors at this time. I'm his wilderness guide. I just want to check on him before I leave." Her expression softened. "I understand, but those are the doctor's orders. He's stable, if that helps." It didn't. I needed to see him to confirm with my own eyes what was happening to him. Had the infection stopped spreading? Had they found a way to treat it? "Could you at least give him a message?" I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Tell him James stopped by, and that..." I paused, unsure what to say that wouldn't sound suspicious. "Tell him to stay strong." The government car dropped me at my cabin late that evening. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it 5 days ago. The coffee mug still on my desk, papers spread beside my reading chair, the week's firewood stacked neatly by the stove. It felt like stepping into someone else's life. I built a fire and sat watching the flames, replaying the events at Lake Minnewanka in my mind. The image of Vanessa digging in the forest dirt like an animal. John's lifeless body suddenly reanimating with those jerking, inhuman movements. Dave's skin burning with fever as black veins spread from his infected wound. Had I really seen those things? Or had stress and fear warped my perceptions? I pulled out my phone and searched for news about the incident. There was surprisingly little. A brief mention of a hiking accident in Banff National Park that had resulted in 2 deaths. No names, no details. As if the whole thing was being deliberately kept quiet. The next morning I called Charleston University, hoping to learn more about the students. The department secretary confirmed they had all returned safely to South Carolina, but refused to connect me with any of them directly, citing ongoing recovery from the tragic accident. When I asked specifically about Dave Wilson, she said only that he was no longer enrolled this semester, and quickly ended the call. Weeks passed. I canceled my remaining fall guiding commitments, telling clients I needed time for personal matters. I couldn't face taking another group into the wilderness. Not yet. Not until I understood what had happened. I made discreet inquiries about the official investigation, calling contacts in the Park Service and local law enforcement. No one had details they could share. The case had been classified and sealed, unusual for a simple hiking accident or even an assault. October turned to November. Snow began to dust the foothills around my cabin. I found myself jumping at small sounds in the night, reaching for my knife when branches scraped against the roof in the wind. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Vanessa and John were dead, that whatever had infected them had been contained. But I couldn't shake the memory of Dave's face as the black veins spread across his skin, or the way his eyes had cleared momentarily when he grabbed my wrist at the ranger station. If I become like them, you have to. I hadn't let him finish that sentence. I hadn't wanted to hear what he was asking me to do. December arrived with heavy snow and bitter cold. I worked through my winter preparations mechanically, checking the generator, stacking extra firewood, stocking the pantry with supplies. Soon I would close the cabin and head south for winter, guiding work in Arizona and New Mexico, as I did every year. Usually the change of scenery helped clear my mind after a long season. This year I doubted anything would help. Every time I opened my filing cabinet, I saw the folder labeled Charleston University 2018 sitting there like an accusation. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, but I couldn't bear to read through it again either. It represented a physical reminder of something inexplicable, something that challenged everything I understood about the natural world. Then, 3 months ago in early January, a letter arrived. The envelope bore a South Carolina postmark and handwriting I recognized immediately. Dave Wilson. My heart raced as I tore it open, scanning the cramped lines for answers. The letter was dated December 28th, nearly 4 months after the incident at Lake Minnewanka. Dave wrote that after 2 weeks under observation, he'd been released from the hospital with a clean bill of health. The doctors claimed the infection had responded to aggressive antibiotic treatment, though they couldn't identify exactly what had caused it. For a while, Dave had believed them. He returned to South Carolina, moved back into his apartment, and tried to resume his life. The university arranged for him to complete his semester requirements through independent study. Everything seemed normal for the first few weeks. Then, the hunger started. Dave described it as overwhelming, a gnawing emptiness that regular food couldn't satisfy. He tried eating more, different foods, vitamin supplements. Nothing helped. The hunger only grew, accompanied by restlessness, heightened senses, and disturbing dreams he couldn't quite remember upon waking. My hands shook as I read his account of what happened next. One night, while his girlfriend Sarah was visiting, Dave lost control. He attacked her, and when he came to his senses, he was covered in blood, her blood. Sarah was hospitalized with what everyone believed was an animal attack. Dave had told them he fought off whatever creature had come through the open window, but he knew the truth. There had been no animal. He had attacked Sarah himself. The letter ended with Dave's desperate plea for help, understanding what was happening to him. He admitted he was afraid he might hurt someone else. He wrote that he planned to isolate himself at his family's hunting cabin in the mountains of western North Carolina, where he couldn't harm anyone while he figured out what he was becoming. "I can feel it changing me," he wrote in a shaky hand on the final page. "Whatever infected Vanessa and John is still inside me, James. It never left. The doctors didn't cure it. They just slowed it down. Please, if you know anything more about what happened to us, anything that might help me understand this hunger, this transformation. I need to know, before I become something I can't come back from. He'd included his cell phone number and the address of the cabin, begging me to contact him if I had any insights. I had read that letter dozens of times since it arrived, had called the number repeatedly, only to reach voicemail each time. Had considered driving to North Carolina to find him, but what could I tell him? I had no answers, only the same horrible memories that haunted my dreams. No explanation for what had infected them all, or why Dave's transformation was happening so much more slowly than the others. I sat at my desk, the letter in front of me, snow falling softly outside my window. In a few weeks, I would close up the cabin and travel south for my winter guiding work. But for the first time in my career, I found myself dreading the wilderness rather than seeking its solace. The folder containing all the documentation from the trip sat beside the letter: contracts, medical forms, emergency contacts, the route plan. Everything that, on paper, made the expedition look like any other university field trip I'd led over the years. But something had gone terribly wrong at Lake Minnewanka. Something had turned Vanessa, then John, and now apparently Dave, into creatures driven by hunger and predatory instinct. Something I'd never encountered in 22 years of wilderness guiding, and I had no idea how to stop it.